The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. At a time when workers are under attack at historic levels, strikes are making a comeback. In that, Jane McAlevey sees an opportunity to reset power and politics in America and clear a path to progressive change. And we say hello to Jane McAlevey, an organizer, author, and scholar. She's currently a senior policy fellow at the University of California at Berkeley's Labor Center, part of the Institute for Labor and Employment Relations. Jane's most recent book, A Collective Bargain, Unions, Organizing, and the Fight for Democracy. Jane McAlevey, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
It is my pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. This new book won a starred review from Publishers Weekly. That's a rare accomplishment, and congratulations to you. In their review,
thank you.
You're quite welcome. Publishers Weekly called the book, quote, a persuasive argument that the power of strong democratic trade unions can fix many of America's social problems, close quote. What puts labor unions at the center of progressive change?
I think a few things. One is, if you look at just the last 2 years, since there's been sort of a revival of mass collective action, meaning these really large strikes we're having, primarily in the education sector, though not just in the education sector, which is important. I think what you see is the American public standing up and rallying behind a fairly beleaguered institution, by the way, known as the teaching profession, right? That's been under extremely serious attack for 20 years. And despite that, what we realize when the workers decided to, take the future of the education system into their own hands and walk off the job to demand that it returned to being a better education system that we once had in this country when it was well-funded, before the, right wing and the people with the tax cuts began attacking our education system. You see the extraordinary support and solidarity that's breaking out all over the United States. So that's, to me, one example of why both unions matter and can get us out of the mess that we're in is several-fold. One is, fundamentally, people in this country do break in a solidaristic way with each other. Yes, we have a problem with white nationalism, but most people in this country break in a way that breaks towards human solidarity when they see workers standing up for themselves. And we need a lot more of that in this country, both because we need more solidarity, like an active solidarity right now, and because we definitely need workers standing up for themselves. So part of what I try and say in the book is, if you look at two things, which are not going to be unfamiliar to your listeners. One is the current state of the U.S. Supreme Court. And by the way, not just the Supreme Court, like the federal judiciary at this point, right, has been stacked with more extreme right-wing justices than certainly ever in my lifetime. And then in addition to that, you've got, the sort of series of Supreme Court decisions that have made it so that dark money is really running our political system. And that's not going to get undone anytime soon. So as an organizer and a strategist, when I look around at what's available to ordinary Americans to fix the mess called the United States right now, there's one thing left, which is strikes and trade unions and people demanding in the workplace what we deserve, because the democratic institutions that have long governed this country are hugely broken right now. And to reset them, I think is going to take in 2020, 2022, 2024, 2025, 6, 7, this entire coming decade is going to take what it took in the 1930s to reset political power and balance in the United States. And that took workers in large numbers walking off the job.
Well, and specifically thinking of the teachers' strikes that we've seen, and again, not exclusively to education, but it's not just about their pay. It's about the whole system.
Yeah.
And I think that's where you're really starting to pick up some steam and getting some people that are maybe out on the fringes or don't even know anything about it, saying, hey, that's not right. These folks need help, and they get the support that way.
Yeah, that's right. And that's an important point you're making, because it reflects the education strikers. I'm just going to call them education because it's bigger than just teachers. But these teachers and educators with them who are walking off the job are doing it in a way where they're making very clear that their demands list is a great education system. It's the schools every kid deserves, right? That's the theme throughout the education strikes, is educators striking to demand a rebuild of the public education system to the point where, and again, just to state the obvious, like good the way it was when it was more robustly funded before the 1980s and decades of tax cuts came. When I went to public school, we had a full-time nurse in our school. We had, before school started, sports and athletics. We had after school started sports and athletics. We had art every single day and gym every single day, and a nurse and a librarian and a guidance counselor. Do you know how few schools have that right now? And that's one reason only, which is the super rich and the corporate elite of this country pocketing all the money that used to go to places like to fund art classes and guidance counselors and school nurses. Literally the difference between the late 1970s and early 1980s, when I was still a public high school student, and today is that there's a bunch of money lining the already bulging pockets of the super rich. And that has got to be reversed in this country. And I honestly, my read as both an organizer in the trade union sector and a contract negotiator, but also like I've run political campaigns, environmental campaigns, like my entire life experience and then my PhD work and my postdoc work at Harvard have all confirmed for me there really is no other way out of the mess that we're in this country of extreme polarization fueled by a sort of faux populist right, unless and until workers begin to stand up for themselves, again, in really large numbers, and do it in a way that the teachers are doing it, meaning message the broader community that this fight we're having is not about our wages, it's about our wages, right? Like the entire country's wages. Like every fight right now is about a fight for the future of this country.
Absolutely. And you brought something up. Let's talk about the historical context for the book. It's decades of a concerted effort by folks that you brought up earlier, corporate class, and the willing politicians, willing to suppress the labor movement in the U.S. What do you consider the most damaging impact of that effort that we're living with today?
I think one that's becoming more and more familiar to people, and it's in part thanks to the candidacies of people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and, the sort of non-corporate Democrats, people are actually talking again about the single biggest blow. There was one massive blow, which was the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, and that was the act that was passed to roll back the clock on the gains that American workers were making, right? So there's a history chapter in the book, and I break it down into three waves of attacks on American workers. One was the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 that sort of presaged and began the Cold War period. The second was what I call the weaponization of globalization. Like when I look back in history, I think, frankly, when we all look back at history, we're going to realize that this thing called globalization was nothing but union busting, which is what I argue in the book. Like it really served no function except to break unions in the sort of industrial West in the United States and Europe, et cetera, and to offshore every decent unionized job from Germany to France to England to the United States to Canada to some place where workers have no rights and something much closer to slavery exists. And that is a large part of the world, quite frankly, right? When you're locked into a factory, a Foxconn factory making iPhones in China, by the way, you have zero rights. You have no rights. So that corporation decided to offshore all of the best paying unionized jobs all over the world, to me, is going to be understood as nothing but wave two of massive union busting. And then the third wave began essentially with the 2010 midterms. A lot of work on the part of the I think often smarter than the Democrats or smarter than the progressives, like the super right wing in the form of the Koch brothers, that ilk, Karl Rove, the crowd that's been dominating the political discourse and really, frankly, out-muscling or outsmarting a lot of the progressives, is that they focused for like 20 years on the census and taking state legislatures. When they got them, which they needed to undo the public sector, which most Americans don't understand, so I'm just going to get the three waves clear for you, is that they had to find a way into the states because public sector labor law is governed state by state, not by one federal law, the way the National Labor Relations Act is. So 2010 marks the beginning of the third wave, which is like the vociferous, brutal attack on the public sector unions that we've been seeing, right? Sustained attacks since 2010. So three big waves. 1947, attack on all unions. That's the Taft-Hartley Act. And then I pinpoint it to like 73, 72, 73, 74, the beginning of a concerted effort at offshoring jobs in a really massive way, not just a little plant, but going. And the sort of architecture and the narrative of neoliberalism taking hold in the United States. And then 2010 begins what we call like the final offensive, right? Like in the mind of the Koch brothers, they are damn close to wiping unions out in this country. We are down to less than 6% in the private sector and less than 11% overall. So those are pretty terrifying numbers, except if you realize, which we should put this part on a positive note, those were the same numbers in 1932, right? And then the biggest growth in unions ever happened essentially overnight. Like you could see a scenario where a non-corporate Democrat wins the White House and behaves the way Roosevelt did, right? An unconventional president wins the presidency. It's a remote possibility, and I don't mean unconventional like a white nationalist like the one we have. I mean unconventional in a good way. Wins the presidency, right? I mean, we've got an unconventional lunatic.
I think I was safe in assuming what you meant on that one.
I know. But, the important thing for listeners is American unions were this down in the dumps at the end of the 1920s. And that period feels a lot to me like the late 1920s and the very early 1930s does feel similar in a lot of ways, not just in the U.S., but in the global historical moment we're in of like strong men, authoritarianism, Trump-like racist white nationalist, anti-immigrant characters, all over the place winning office. By the way, not winning legitimately, by the way, but I should say becoming the quote-unquote elected leaders in many a country. So the periods are the feel around the world. I'm working a lot in Europe now. It feels a lot like the United States. Unions are under attack. Working class people are under attack. People are getting the sort of elite, have merged across the top of all the political parties. And they're ruling for themselves, and unless people in this country start to stand up for themselves again, we're going to be in a lot more trouble. But I think if people stand up for themselves right now, as we're seeing people doing, we have a real shot at turning this whole thing around in a pretty profound way.
We're speaking with Jane McAlevey. She is a senior policy fellow at the University of California, Berkeley's Labor Center, part of the Institute for Labor and Employment Relations. And her latest book is A Collective Bargain, Unions, Organizing, and the Fight for Democracy. And Jane, now kind of turning the focus to the current context of the book, is that unions are making a comeback. Why now? Is it more than just the strikes?
I think the strikes are reflective of the absolute state of despair that most of Americans find themselves in, to be honest. And that's what I mean about it feeling a bit like 1930 and 31 and 32 in this country right now, right? I mean, there was like 1 in 4 people were unemployed in the Great Depression. I'm arguing in the book that the same level of misery exists right now. It's just more, it's not as easy to see because you can't just say 1 in 4 are unemployed. What you can see, if you're like me out in the field as a union organizer, is people running to like make 5 different jobs make sense, and they're working 90 hours, stitching together 5 different kinds of pay systems, and they're falling behind, and it's both parents working, not one. And frankly, people are committing suicide, right? Our birth rate is going down. I mean, there are very serious things wrong in this country, very serious things wrong. And people really, Like once you get out of like a major urban area, and even if you're in it, if you keep your eyes wide open in a certain way, you will just see the level of misery that's going on in this country. People are realizing that the system is horribly skewed against them. The most disgusting of all the tax cuts, the most recent one, right, in 2017 under Trump, just the super rich get a giant tax break. I think people have had it. I mean, to put it bluntly, I just think people have had it. And the question is, are we going to trend in a right-wing populist direction, or are we going to trend in a progressive populist direction? And I think the unions that have led those big strikes are pulling us in the direction of a more progressive form of populism, just like they did in 1932 and 33, right? I mean, we didn't get the big benefits from FDR's administration. I mean, we got relief, right, from insanity the minute he took over, which we could get again if someone good won. Just relief from, like, are we going to war tomorrow in Iran? You know, I mean, we need relief from a lot of pain right now. But to turn the whole system around, it took FDR another 3 years. And it took workers, by the way, striking like crazy in 33 and 34. And I lift that up a lot in the book because I think people forget. Like they think, oh, FDR, the New Deal, things just got good for the average worker. There were massive strikes that happened in 32, 33, 34, right up until 35 when Congress began, forced by a level of strike activity in this country that was bringing, frankly, corporations and the capitalist class kind of to its knees legislatively, because that's what big strikes can do. And I'm arguing we're going to have to do a whole lot more of them before we can imagine bringing the power imbalance back to something somewhat fair in this country, right? Income inequality is a reflection of power inequality. And the power inequality we're trapped right now, given the political, like the campaign contribution system in politics is so broken. Everyone knows that. The Supreme Court is only recently broken. People are just starting to understand how broken our court system is about to be. And again, he's got all those federal judiciary judges stacking every single one of the federal district courthouses right now, not just the Supremes. And if you take those two things together, I am sorry, but I see no other. I mean, I've worked every part of the progressive movement in this country. I was a community organizer, an environmental organizer, a political campaigner, and then found my whole life home, in the labor movement. And I don't think there's any way out. And as an organizer, I've had the experience, even just in the last couple of years, of like working with workers to win contracts that are literally life-changing, that change the entire life of the family, and depending on how big the facility is, the whole community around them. And that kind of rebalancing of economic and political power is going to come through strikes.
We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing or one time in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee.
My newspaper died. Well, technically it still appears, but it has no life, no news, and barely a pulse. It's a mere semblance of a real paper, one of the hundreds of local journalism zombies staggering along in cities and towns that had long relied on them. Each one has a bare number of subscribers keeping it going, mostly longtime readers like me, clinging to a memory of what used to be and a flickering hope that surely the thing won't get worse. Then it does. Our papers are getting worse at a time we desperately need them to get better because they are no longer mediums of journalism, civic purpose, and local identity. Rather, they've been reduced to little more than profit siphons, steadily piping local money to a handful of distant high-finance syndicates that have bought out our hometown journals. My daily, the Austin American-Statesman, was swallowed up in 2019 by the nationwide Gannett chain, becoming one of more than 1,000 local papers Gannett presently mass-produces under its corporate banner, the USA Today Network. But even that reference is a deception, for the publication doesn't confide to readers that it's actually a product of SoftBank Group, a multi-billion-dollar Japanese financial consortium that owns and controls Gannett. SoftBank has no interest in Austin as a place, a community, or even as a newspaper market, nor does it care one whit about advancing the principles of journalism. It's in the profit business, extracting maximum short-term payouts from the properties it owns. This has rapidly become the standard business model for American newspapering. Today, more than half of all daily papers in America are in the grip of just 10 of these money syndicates. This is Jim Hightower saying, that's why our local papers are dying. It's not a failure of journalism, but of absentee corporate owners plundering journalism.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We're talking with Jane McAlevey about her powerful new book, A Collective Bargain, Unions, Organizing, and the Fight for Democracy. She makes the case that unions are central to challenging the corporate class and restoring democracy in America. But what about the millions of workers who don't have a union? For Jane McAlevey, that translates into even more opportunity to build the power of organized labor. There are millions of American workers in non-union jobs. What's the potential now for unions to reach out to these workers, given the state of everything you just mentioned?
I mean, ironically, I think it's good. Like if the American unions would actually focus in the way that we need them to, which as an organizer is always the struggle I'm in, right? Like I believe unions are the solution. On the other hand, I've been in plenty of internal battles myself within the labor movement, right? It's not a perfect movement by any stretch, but it does represent the one institution that can right the ship of this country right now. And so for all those non-unionized workers, there's two things that are really interesting to me. One is something called the Epic Systems case, which was ruled on last year in the Supreme Court. It got very little attention. And the Epic Systems case essentially says, very complicated case. So it's three cases they rolled into one. I'm just going to say the obvious thing it does. It points non-union workers to unions because it essentially said that federal arbitration law was going to supersede all other kinds of federal law, and that all the non-union workers in this country can now be bound as a condition of hiring by binding mandatory arbitration agreements. So now 60%, that's 60%, and the number is going up almost every day. I keep tracking it. 60% of non-union American workers are now under forced arbitration agreements that include things like all of them basically say you can't enter a class action lawsuit. So all of the legal redress that was available to American workers sort of post-civil rights movement through the women's movement up until last year, have been stripped away from American workers. You can no longer, most of those arbitration agreements say you can't sue your employer. You can't sue your employer individually. You can't sue your employer through a class action lawsuit. Many of the arbitration agreements that 60% of Americans are being forced to sign right now as a condition of hire say you can't even talk to a coworker about a complaint you have at work, or you're in violation of a forced agreement you had to sign to get the job. So, and most people don't know they're signing them. I want to be really clear about this. Most Americans do not know when you're sitting through the new orientation packet that you're given. It's like, sign this for your whatever, sign that for your whatever, waive your whatever. They're signing these forced arbitration agreements. And by the way, most don't have a choice, right? You need a job. You sign that piece of paper. The one way out of forced arbitration agreements governing most American workplaces, and again, they're on the uptick quickly now that the Supreme Court codified this in its last session. The only way out of it is to form a union and to bargain a collective hire agreement over an individual arbitration agreement. It's literally the only thing left. So black workers who used to sue racist employers, or women at the height of the Me Too movement, right? The Supreme Court passes this thing saying forced arbitration agreements are going to supersede other kinds of law, like the Fair Standards Act. I mean, it's an amazing ruling, and because Americans, so few Americans, why would you understand the details of employment law? Didn't pay attention to it. The case that got all the attention last year was the Janus case, right? Which essentially meant that every single public sector union across the country, every worker can drop or join the union every day, even if it's a unionized workplace. So that case got all the attention. The case from a union organizer's perspective that matters a great deal is the Epic Systems case, because one, most American workers just got a really bad deal from the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, that's a really bad ruling. And two, the only way out of that ruling is to form a union. So I say, form a union.
Right. The short story is unionize.
Yeah, or be bound, by these horrific rules that employers are passing now. Anyway, it's crazy.
Sports Illustrated, falling apart. Every single corner of the place, it's a shambles. They're unionizing. It's their one way to try and survive. It's a lot of different ways that union and unionizing and union organizing can help and save a job and make a job better. In writing this book, you traveled the country, spoke to workers in many sectors of the economy. You've spent most of your life in the labor movement. Did anything surprise you?
Yeah. No. Well, I think the one thing that has surprised me in the most pleasant way is because the thing I touched on earlier, it isn't just watching Americans stand up and support striking workers. It is, even though the education strikes really have been education, meaning that there's been the West Virginia strike that kicked it all off, right? The bus drivers, the cafeteria workers, they were all actually, in my analysis of the West Virginia strike, which I've written about for a lot of magazines, and it's also in the book, that strike, which is called the teacher strike, wouldn't have happened if the bus drivers hadn't walked off the job, literally. And that's what a bunch of superintendents tell me in West Virginia too. If the kids were being delivered to the schools, there would have been injunctions against the teachers. So that's an important lesson, that it takes all the workers to win. But then if you look at, in terms of what excites me, if you look at the unbelievable and strategic attack on teachers and teachers unions that's been 25 years strong. I think it starts in 1995. We have Hollywood movies like Waiting for Superman. We have, a story a day, blaming the failure of public schools on teachers and teachers unions. And despite that, it's like watching the teachers unions rip the scab of lies that is like a house of cards for the white nationalists and the radical right in this country, because no matter how much messaging they did to try to destroy the image of a teacher and a teachers union specifically, the polling was something like 83% of Americans supported every teacher strike in the last 2 years. That is the most encouraging thing. And if I were a worker who didn't have a union, I'd be running like mad to form one. It's hard to do, by the way. The book tells you a lot about it. Actually, the chapter I wrote called How to Get One is from the last big campaign I was just running, where we helped nurses and technical workers in 7 hospitals in Philadelphia form unions in 2016 and 2017. It was a bit of a record, but we did it. And I walked people through like what it took for those workers to form new unions. And so the book has there's a lot in the book that instructs people on how to get a union. And then I also have a chapter called How Do You Rebuild One? Because I end it on the magnificent strike by the Los Angeles teachers. And that's a great example of a union that, quite frankly, wasn't all that exciting for like 20 years. It got kind of, do nothing-ish, like institutions can get if they're not kept lively. And in that last chapter, I wrote a whole chapter about how a bunch of good teachers came in and rebuilt that union and took it over. And boy, it's night and day. It's a beautiful, powerful instrument of the working class in city politics, in federal. There were those 7 congressional seats that flipped. I make this point in the LA Teachers Union chapter. Those 7 congressional seats that were crucial to the takeover of the House in 2018 in the midterms, 7 of them came from Greater Los Angeles, where, that election turnout was directly benefited from the extraordinary strike building work that was going on among the Teachers Union in Los Angeles. So, yeah, there's a lot of encouraging things out there. The question is, can the progressive movement, focus? You know what I mean? And that's what I'm trying to call attention to. Yes, there's a lot of things that need attention. There's a lot of things that we need to protest. There's a lot of things we need to resist. But at the end of the day, if we're trying to figure out how to save American democracy and literally end the most extreme polarization of my lifetime, and again, I understand that there were periods that were highly polarized in the 60s and 50s and earlier, but coming of age, coming out of high school after Ronald Reagan was already president, or being able to vote after Reagan was already president. In my entire lifetime, we haven't had a moment this polarizing. And as a union organizer, we deal with high, intense polarization all the time in the workplace, right? That's what every union buster does. And I say, hey, people, the union buster's in the White House, and he's running the whole country like it's one big union busting campaign right now, driving division, driving wedges between us. And people who do union organizing are really familiar with this. And so using the tools that union organizers have learned about how do we build supermajority unity in the face of huge polarization, that is the lesson right now that I think the progressive movement needs to wake up, take a break, stare at it. What has the capacity to unify America? Because a good union fight unifies really disparate people of different ethnicities and different genders and different backgrounds. Every union fight is like a mini example of how you unify America with union busters that are just like Stephen Miller, Stephen Bannon, and Donald Trump. So it's like my whole universe is a bunch of awful human beings driving an evil agenda that divides working people, and then they win, right? And in a union campaign, we have to overcome that, and we do, and then we defeat them. The whole country needs that right now.
The beginning part of that sounded like a nightmare you might have been having, actually. You mentioned Bannon and the rest. But before we let you go, we are in the midst of an election season. I'm not sure if you knew that. I think you probably did.
Oh, are we? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Democrats they'll work hard to convince working class voters to support them. But what do they have to do to make that genuine? Because I'm not hearing that across the board.
Yeah, I'm not either, to be honest. I mean, part of why I mentioned Warren and Sanders is because I think there is so much legitimate cynicism in this country, legitimate right now, towards, frankly, both parties, right? That's how we wound up with the Donald Trump in the White House, in addition to division and a whole bunch of other things. But it's voter suppression, electoral college. Okay, we digress. But I think you can't. Part of what matters, my experience as a union organizer, again, always highly polarized. Every election I've run, winning a union election with thousands of workers inside of a big hospital, say, and which I've spent a lot of my life doing, is incredibly difficult because they just, the employers control all the rules, functionally speaking, during union election. So they're totally skewed, just like American elections are becoming totally skewed, which is why I keep thinking we have to look at what union organizers deal with in order to figure out how to overcome what's going on in this country. But so I think part of the thing that I teach, and I tell people when I'm teaching workers how to win, is the person who you need to recruit in your unit or your shift, and in the case of political races, in your political precinct, are the people who are most trusted by their coworkers, because that is who their coworker will look to at a moment when the boss is saying, rip off your sticker, I'm going to fire you if you wear that union button, which, by the way, happens every day in an American election inside of a union. Like, they'll tell them to take off their stickers, take off your union buttons, and all illegal. They'll just say all these illegal things, right? Because that's what employer class does. So, and workers will take them off, and workers will lose their election if they do, and workers will take them off because they're scared. And so the way that we win is by recruiting the most trusted, which usually means very good workers. And so when I look at the national political race, I think the person who's likely to win is the person who people believe to be genuine in what they're actually promising on the campaign trail. Because people are sick and tired of being promised stuff and having it not happen in this country, right? That is part of why we wound up with a white nationalist, most dangerous person I've ever met in the White House right now, is because people are cynical that candidates across the parties are in fact not genuine. So I think what you raise matters a lot, and I'm going to argue that it's the people who have been genuine for a long time in their beliefs that stand the best chance of winning in this country, and that brings us down to just a couple of them, in my view. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would have to agree. Jane McAlevey, organizer, author, scholar, senior policy fellow at the University of California at Berkeley's Labor Center. Jane's most recent book, again, A Collective Bargain, Unions, Organizing, and the Fight for Democracy. Jane, we appreciate your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We'd love to do it again with you soon.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
I see from your latest in the Bulwark that, Ted Cruz called you a hack. I mean, I know you had this little confrontation with him out in Arizona. Here's just a little bit of it.
Hey, Senator. Good to see you in Arizona.
It's good to be here.
You objected to the 2020 vote here in Arizona. And in the Senate, you were the lead Senate objector to that. Since then, there have been a few audits. The Republican governor, Republican Senate president, the Republican Speaker of the House all said the election was fair. Do you disagree with Doug Ducey and agree with Blake Masters and Carrie Lake, or have you changed your view? It's been 2 years now.
There's a reason the media is a joke, because questions like that, please, let's have one Republican fight with another Republican.
People of Arizona voted for Joe Biden.
Look, I get...
Wait, no, right? Did they not? Did they or did they not vote for Joe Biden?
Your job
did they or
is
did
to
they
be
not
a shill
vote for Joe Biden?
But that's not your job, and I don't care about your political agenda.
I don't have. I'm asking you. Did you try to object to their vote?
You're done.
Why am I done?
Because you're being a hack.
Wow, sounds like quite an encounter. Tell us about it. What happened?
Yeah, well, usually you just dismiss Ted Cruz name calling you, but he does have some expertise in hackery. So I did some reflection on it. But yeah, the gist was, I was there. I was taping The Circus for Showtime, which aired last night, Sunday night, and I was the guest host this week, and he was in Arizona. It was Ted Cruz, for people that don't remember, who objected to the state's electoral count.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Yeah, and he was the main. You needed a Senate and a House objector. Now they had some crazy Republican House members like Paul Gosar, et cetera, who could do it in the House, but there was 2 Democratic senators from Arizona, so they needed Cruz to be the one that actually made this objection happen on January 6th. Well, it's been 20 months since that. And there have been 3 audits, and the Republican governor of Arizona has upheld the results. And any sane person knows that there was no fraud at this point. And so I felt like, given that he was in the state, it was an appropriate time to check in with him and see if maybe he'd updated his thinking on whether the election in Arizona was fraudulent in 2020. He didn't want to go there, of course. He just ignored that question completely and name called me and name called Joe Biden. Which I guess is right, but I think that the point here is that these guys, Masters too, is in the same boat in Arizona, are stuck in the situation where they can't tell the truth about the election because the lie has grown and grown, and the beast is out of their control now, and so they don't want to get fruit thrown at them by their own fans who are there in attendance. But at the same time, they're trying to back off the crazy because they know it's repelling swing voters in critical states like Arizona.
Yeah, so they're really caught right between the rock and the hard place. This is the lie that they helped create, they perpetuated, right? Yeah. And now it could come back and bite them in the ass.
God willing. I'm concerned. I think it certainly could come back and bite Masters in the ass. I think some of the others, Carrie Lake, who is very scary, who's running for governor of the state, is much more adept at walking this lie than hackish Ted Cruz and Blake Masters, and I'm concerned that it's working for her, but it's not. It certainly is something that Cruz and Masters are struggling to negotiate.
Well, help me out. Don't I remember that Donald Trump called Ted Cruz's wife ugly, that Donald Trump accused Ted Cruz's father of being part of the plot to assassinate John F. Kennedy, and now Ted Cruz is the apologist for Donald Trump?
Yeah, and I'm the hack. It is funny. And the other wrinkle to this, Bill, is that, and I think this is why, so Ted, it's kind of fun for listeners who don't know, I used to be literally a political hack and a communications guy for Republicans, and so it's been fun to be on the other side of the gaggle and just get to create trouble. I've been enjoying that and that change. But Cruz walks right up to me and looks at me to have me ask the first question. I think it's because somewhere in that little lizard brain he remembered that for 3 months I supported Ted Cruz because he was the only way to stop Trump. Remember, he does the vote your conscience at the convention. And it was 3 days after that convention that his pollster called me, and I went and I went to meet him at a bar, and he showed me Ted's poll numbers after his "Vote Your Conscience" speech at the convention, and I'd never seen anything like it. He went from like an 80% approval with Republicans to a 20% approval in 4 days. Right. And so that's the answer to your question. Why is Ted Cruz acting like this? Why is Ted Cruz, sucking up to the guy that insulted his dad and wife? Why is he lashing out at me? Well, it's because he has to, if he wants to stay in the Senate and get all the attention that he craves.
So he's sort of emblematic, one of the people you talk about in your book, Why We Did It. By the way, congratulations. I love the book. It's a real wild read. And look, Tim, you were right in the heart of it. I mean, as you call yourself a professional hatchet man, you work for a lot of these guys. You were communications director for the RNC. You are right in the middle of it. What if you had to describe Donald Trump in one word, right? I know that's tough, but what would it be?
Irredeemable? I don't know. Despicable? Something like that. I hate him.
That's my question, and you that's what your book is all about. How did somebody who is irredeemable, who is despicable, take over the entire Republican Party in like 6 months? How'd you let it happen?
Yeah, well,
not you, but the party.
Me in part. This was a long time coming, and so this is why the first half of the book is basically this look back. And I'm sure you, Bill, could have taken us back on a tour to the 80s in California or something. But I wanted to start where I saw things firsthand, which was with Palin.
Yeah,
and look, we were playing with fire this whole time in the Republican establishment. We knew that there was a reactionary strain within the party base. There were obviously some reactionaries who got elected in certain places in Congress, et cetera. It wasn't like it wasn't like Donald Trump was the first one. And we were playing this big game. We wanted to beat the Democrats, and so we'd get the base all riled up, throw them red meat. They'd listen to Rush, they'd listen to Fox. And get mad and aggrieved about whatever it was that week, immigrants or college elites, or all the same things that they're mad about now, really. And And we figured that we were kind of the adults, right, in charge that could put bumpers on the extremism and use their energy to get more normal Republicans like Mitt Romney or whoever elected. And there was some logic to that because it worked kind of for a while, right? But
Right.
it really shouldn't have been surprising that somebody who more authentically could channel their grievances, even though it's a performance for him, he's a much better performer, could disrupt this whole game. And it's something we should have seen coming. It almost happened with Palin, frankly. It almost happened in 2012 with Herman Cain and Michelle Bachmann and Gingrich. And it was, I think, to anybody whose eyes were open, it was inevitable that it was going to happen eventually. And in parts of my brain, this is what the book's about. This is why I, wrap myself on the knuckles over and over again. I knew it, right? Like I saw it, that this was possible. I didn't think it would be someone quite as irredeemable and despicable as Donald Trump, but he was just leveraging all the same tools that we were using much more effectively.
So what was your come to Jesus moment, if I can use that phrase? Yeah. Where you said, I just can't take it anymore, right? My soul will not allow me to stay here and pretend that I can be part of this mess.
The real answer, because I think it's important to understand, is that it wasn't one. And there were three, right? And I'll just be very quick. But I knew it with Palin. I wrote about it at the beginning of the book. That's why the first chapter is about the McCain campaign. I knew it. And I got back in anyway, the first time for good intentions, right? I worked for John Huntsman, who was the most moderate candidate to run, in my lifetime. I agreed with him on basically everything. And so, then I kind of get pulled back in Godfather style, into the game. Trump wins the nomination. And really, it was late in that process. I thought we were going to be able to beat him late in the process. But he was so far afield for me. I never even considered for a moment that I might support Donald Trump. That said, when he finally wins a year later, I did go in and help Scott Pruitt. And it was, I didn't go into the EPA. I just helped him with his confirmation. I needed something to do. I felt desperate. I didn't have a job. And so, even I, despite seeing him as irredeemable, kind of was a participant, a collaborator in this at some level. Now, it didn't last that long. And eventually I told Scott Pruitt's communications guy to tell him to stop calling me. but it wasn't like even that was one big moment. It was a gradual over time. I was just like, no, I can't do this. I need to, move to California and clean myself and try to figure out what to do with my life. So it really wasn't like, Saul falling off the horse. It's something that happened over time, and awareness that grew over time.
So in the book, that first half of the book is all about you. And then you also talk about some of the other people around Trump, including people, like Paul Ryan, for example, or others who they didn't like Trump. They didn't like his style. They didn't, I don't know about policies. They certainly didn't like his lifestyle, right? But they went along with him anyway.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, there are a bunch of reasons, and that's kind of what I diagram in the second half of the book. And I really focus on people like Paul Ryan and Reince Priebus, as Wisconsin, who is my boss, because these, it's easy to sit back and just say, okay, my political enemy, if you're a Democrat listening to this, they're all sociopaths and racists, right? Like that's why they did it. They all love him actually secretly, and and it's like, well, humans are more complicated than that, right? Like there are some sociopaths and there are some racists around Donald Trump, no doubt. There also were a bunch of people who really genuinely didn't like him, but they played tricks with their own brain, or they had darker angels that motivated them to do it. And it was mostly either, access to power, the fame and the celebrity and the rush that comes from politics, convincing themselves that they really loathe the left. And this is something that in all my interviews for the book really caught me off guard, was how much the deep-seated grievance they have over stupid stuff, pronouns or whatever. That is part of it. Some of them were on the more earnest side of the scale, like actually thought it was like, well, we need good people to serve the government, but then that becomes a very convenient excuse, right? Like you convince yourself that you're needed, in order to take a job you kind of want, right? And so, I go through each archetype, and some are just like Elise Stefanik, just purely driven by ambition and power, and I think for certain people it's a combination of the various reasons.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.